Welcome to today's podcast. My name is Pearlie Brewer, and I will be your host. Today's podcast guest is Kaela Ballum. Today we're going to talk about women in health and safety, specifically the journey to becoming and growing as a health and safety professional. Welcome, Kaela.
Thank you, Pearlie. Appreciate it. Happy to be here.
Always nice to talk to you. Kaela, why don't you start by telling us about your journey to becoming a corporate health and safety manager with a broad scope across North America?
Yeah, sure. So I don't really know that there is a conventional path to health and safety or becoming a lead in health and safety. I think that everyone's journey looks a little bit different, including my own. I think as we progress through the years, education and things like that are becoming more of a staple of where people start. I think back in the day when it comes to being a safety professional, whether we're talking about 50 years ago, 30, 20, 10, et cetera, whatever the case may be, everyone's journey looks a little different. So just to share a little bit about my own, I moved to Texas from Nova Scotia when I was 11 years old. My entire family works in the offshore oil and gas sector. So my dad was transferred there. I did middle school and high school in Texas. Got used to that living environment there, was exposed to offshore oil at a young age, traveled a lot that way, had moved between, Texas, Aberdeen, Scotland, and then eventually my dad was sent to Saudi Arabia. So kind of been a little bit worldly experience from a personal standpoint, but from a professional standpoint, I took night school and summer school to graduate high school early. When I lived in Texas, it was an option, and I was really young. I didn't really know what I wanted to do, so I went back to NSCC and took a certificate in office information technology at the time, just to kind of see what I wanted to do. From there, I knew that I liked organizing and planning, so I decided that I was going to take event coordinating, which was going to be at Algonquin College in Ottawa. Although you had to have a prerequisite for that, I decided to take hospitality management. So I got a diploma in hospitality management to then pursue event coordinating. At that time, through different summer student jobs, working for different towns or cities as an event coordinator, I decided that I loved it, but I didn't necessarily love it as a full-time gig. I like to do it more on the side. So what I had decided at that point is let's use the education that I did receive. I decided to work actually managing a restaurant, bar, and grill for a year, get exposure to leading people at a young age and just working that customer service aspect of things. And from there, I actually applied to work on an offshore oil rig off the coast of Sable Island, went to work offshore in that capacity. And while I was there, I studied for my gas process operator certificate through SAIT, the Southern Alberta Institute of Technology. At the time, I still really didn't know what I wanted to do, but I liked offshore oil. I liked that sector. My family had come from that, so that was kind of the direction that I had pursued. And while I was out there, I sat on the JOSH committee. They sent me actually to JOSH training at the time. So actually we did that on land. It was actually a 5-day course at the time. It was really thorough and in depth. And I also took my Taproot incident investigative training, which I would highly recommend to anyone. Now, I took this several years ago. However, it's still really popular today. It's one of the key functions that we use for incident investigation. So it was a great experience for me at that time at a young age. At that point, I kind of said, okay, I have this certificate in gas process operations. I knew I potentially may not stay offshore forever. I kind of wanted to carve my own path. So I had some friends who worked for heavy equipment in the oil field in Alberta. I went out there to work kind of with the intention of maybe I'll get on at one of the big oil refineries out there and be a gas process operator and work in operations. What I actually ended up doing was driving a 40-ton rock truck and being a rock truck driver. It's very common out there for all walks of life and all a very diverse career. However, there's a lot of actually young females driving 40-ton rock trucks out there or driving 777s or whatever the case may be. So I actually worked in the mining sector and in the heavy equipment construction phase on all of the oil sands. So I did fly in, fly out there. And while I was there, there was actually an opportunity to become a safety professional. Or at the time, a safety coordinator. So I had went into Fort Mac on my days off and did my NCSO, which is my National Construction Safety Officer designation. At the time, that was the minimum designation you needed to work in the Alberta oil sands. So I had taken that. I started as a night shift safety professional out there, just getting to know kind of the trade, what it was. I'll never forget shaking in my boots the first couple times that I was asked to do a risk assessment or something of that nature. So still pretty fresh in my mind, even though it was years ago. That was kind of the path that led me into HSE. My outlook was, hey, I want to be in operations. I think I know I want to do oil and gas. Don't really know what that looks like. And then I ended up in safety, and the rest was kind of history. I worked on multiple sites out there, everything from CNRL to Curl Lake to Fort Hills to Firebag. So I was there for several years. Actually met my husband there, who was from the east coast of Canada, along with myself. We ended up moving back home, and then I migrated into the manufacturing and farming space. So from a holistic view, top level, I've kind of come from oil and gas to mining, then into some construction, heavy equipment, and then moved to manufacturing and farming. So it's been a broad scope, a really great experience, and lots of different places that I've gotten to gain some experience and diversity.
Now, a lot of people getting into health and safety these days are taking different courses, getting different designations. What are your thoughts, what you've taken, what you would recommend to folks?
Yeah, so when I first started, obviously I didn't know what I didn't know, along with many people. It's kind of like, oh, people are in safety roles. What does that mean? And what does that look like? I think you can take any path. It's really important to know that you don't have to have a certain degree or a certain education to start out in safety. There's lots of opportunities where people are looking for good people who are motivated. I'll speak first to the designation piece. For myself, I took my NCSO, as I mentioned, which is the National Construction Safety Officer designation. That was great for the construction phase of my career. Later on in life, I ended up taking my CRSP, so my Canadian Registered Safety Professional designation. That's one of the highest designations that you can receive within Canada. In the U.S., it's called the CSP. It's very similar. It's the BCRSP that it's through the board in Canada, and the BCSP in the U.S., and et cetera. So there's lots of opportunities. What I really love about that program is they actually even have one step below that, which is called the CRST, which is the Canadian Registered Safety Technician. So ultimately, at the end of the day, the difference between those is that it depends on your level of experience, and then B, also the education that you've taken. So you can take a person right off the ground. You can, pick them off the street and say, you want to become a safety professional. You work towards education, but you also gain experience. So it's really about having that really holistic, round version of, I've kind of hit everything. I don't necessarily just have to be book smart. I don't just need this or that. And really, there's opportunity for anyone. So I love that. I love that we are willing to accept anyone, and kind of you can choose your path. From an education standpoint, depending on geographically where you live, we have options like UNB and SCC Ryerson. As we progress and the industry progresses, I feel that the education is moving along with it. There's more and more opportunities out there to actually see health and safety in the educational institutions, which is great because folks coming out of high school, they can actually look and say, hey, health and safety, maybe that's a field I want to get into, where maybe 20 years ago we didn't have that option.
Now, from a point of view of sort of moving up from going from a coordinator to a specialist to a manager, even a director, what are some of the key differences in these roles, and what sort of a day look like as you've moved through the different roles in health and safety?
Yeah, so starting out as a coordinator, you're really learning the basics, and I don't want to offend anyone on here, because if your title is coordinator, it may mean different things depending on the organization that you work for. So let's keep that in mind as I kind of share my outlook on this. Coordinator looks like day-to-day function. So maybe you're going to the organizational meetings or the operational meetings each day. You're representing the organization from an HSE standpoint. That can be the people on the floor to the supervisors to the manager level. You're dealing with the floor level. I say floor level, ground level, depending on the trade that you're in, functionalities of each day, the issues, you're fighting the fires, you're on the front line, that sort of thing. You're doing basic investigations, but you might not be held accountable for the outcome or maybe the details of those investigations. So it's kind of more the basics. And the next progression beyond that is whether it's a safety specialist or a safety supervisor, you're basically someone who has years of expertise. Maybe you've taken lots of root cause analysis training and used that training. You're really a person that the organization relies on. You're a subject matter expert. So that we're looking more at like the 5 to 10 year experience range when we look at specialists. So it's someone who's had mentorship, worked through that coordinator position and moved up through the ranks. That's kind of what that looks like for us. From a manager perspective, it really looks at, hey, you're directly responsible for an entire safety management program. You may be the individual who's doing the strategic initiatives and setting the goalposts for the organization that you work for. You're more of typically a people leader rather than in the weeds and doing the tactical work. So instead of being at the day-to-day meetings and kind of fighting the fires, you're the one organizing everything and saying, okay, here's where we're driving the ship and here's why we're driving it and helping people understand that.
Now, you've also encountered over the years your experience of working with different provinces, different jurisdictions, with different legislation. What's been your personal experience on that, and how have you handled it?
Yeah, so starting out in Alberta in safety was a really great opportunity for me. One of the things that I really advocate for the legislation that they have out there in particular is that it's really specific. And when you get really specific, there's no opportunity to have gray areas. So I'm not saying that it doesn't exist at all. However, I'm just saying that as a safety person starting out, it was a great opportunity because what we would do is we would have safety folks, including myself when I started, go out and do observations in the field because that's one of the main things that you do as a coordinator. And when you do those observations, saying, okay, what am I looking for and why am I looking for it? If you have the ability to look it up in a book and say, oh gosh, okay, there it is, it's in the legislation. Now I know what to look for and I know why we're doing it and I can apply it. So I ended up understanding the OH&S Act and regulations in Alberta. I probably had it memorized within the first 6 months of being a coordinator because I'd go out and I'd look at the work in front of me and I'd reference the book. And it was a great opportunity to learn as a new safety person. So for me, having a really clear defined legislation supports the initiative of starting new safety professionals out, having them understand. It's kind of like anything. When you have a job, no matter what field you're in, you need to understand the expectations. But if they're not defined and laid out clearly for you, it's really hard to do that, isn't it? So for me, across all of the different provinces or states or countries that we worked in, any province or area that has really defined legislation just supports our people. And it also supports more people wanting to be in our trade and understanding it and not necessarily dealing. It's hard enough being in a new role, let's say, or taking on a new career path. And then on top of that, if we make it more challenging for people. And when we look at legislation that is quite gray or doesn't have a lot of references or it's left to subjectivity or different interpretation, I believe that that's much more challenging, A, for the organizations, and B, for the folks that are here and supposed to be supporting those organizations. So I know that's very generic, but that's my experience. So from the West Coast to the East Coast, I think on the East Coast we have a little bit of work to do to get there so that we can help our organizations get to where they need to be and so that they can be compliant. And you know, even if it's referencing, you know, OSHA, CSA, ISO, whatever, you know, big standards are out there, if that's at the very least what we do, at least that's something more to go off of for our people.
So what are some of the biggest challenges that you have faced in your career to date, and how did you deal with them?
You know what, Pearlie, I don't know that we have time for all of those. There's been a lot. They've looked all sorts of different shapes and sizes for sure. It's like anything. It's just being faced with adversity, especially when you're trying anything new, and I like to do that. So I think the thing that I would say about any challenge that I've been faced with, whether it's been health and safety related or business relationship related, it's really been overcome by having the ability to listen and learn through others and truly actually listen to understand. You want to seek to understand, not just hear what they have to say and wait to respond. You want to have enough empathy for people that you're having that connection and you're being compassionate, but at the same time, you have to set very clear expectations, whether that is, hi, Pearly, we discussed this today. I need you to respond to me by 10 a.m. tomorrow morning in this format. Things need to be set in stone and need to be clear, and that's really important. So in order to alleviate or eliminate and be proactive, that's one of the biggest pieces of advice that I would give, is make sure that all expectations are clear. As I mentioned earlier, a lot of my challenges have also been overcome by not being afraid to have a hard conversation. So if there's anyone out there who struggles with that, I would really suggest coaching, role play. I know a lot of people don't like to do that, especially people with introverted personalities. Get out there, get out of your shell and have those conversations, because if you can face someone head on and without altercation and have a compassionate, reasonable conversation, even if it's a hard one to have and one you don't want to have, usually 9 times out of 10 you come out of that with a positive experience. At the end of the day, relationships in general are 80% of the success that I've had. If you can not only get to know the business, but you get to know the people that are in that business, I promise you that you'll drive better results.
Now, last year we did a number of podcasts with various women in the health and safety field, and we've got some additional ones we'll be doing this year. As a female in the health and safety profession, because again, I'll certainly be able to attest to, I worked in the field for 30 years, and if you go back, anything beyond 5 or 10 years, it was pretty much a male-dominated field. I'm sure you've run into challenges yourself as a female in the field. What were some of those, and how did you go about to deal with those?
Yeah, I think I knew what I was getting into when I set out my sail down the oil field path. So, it's a male-dominated industry. That's just the way it is, right? And I know we have several of them. Doesn't matter if we're talking about finance or what the case may be. We can go in all areas where that is the case. I think it's all about, there's power in numbers, there's power in support. If I was to give, I could probably give lots of examples in terms of the different things I've faced with. It's been anything from, being asked to take notes at a meeting, or, being looked at to pick up the coffee. Now, it's been several years since I've ever had those experiences, but, in camp out west, it could be walking into a meal hall with 5,000 men looking at you, and that sort of thing, where you kind of feel like maybe not necessarily a great feeling of the center of attention type of thing. There's been situations where there's been leaders or supervisors who've, not been ethical or had good morals in terms of leading you. Like, there's just been many things over the years. The biggest thing that I would say is we have to focus on how do we navigate the challenges and how do we get the support that we need. And if you are a young female or even a middle age or whatever the case may be, starting out in, in any sort of industry where it's male dominated, you have to live your life and show up authentically as who you are and just stay true to your roots. And at the end of the day, if that means you have to seek consultation or support internally or externally within an organization, then you should do that. I would never tell any female out there to shy away from, I don't want to say a challenge, but I want to say adversity. That's the way I would say it. And if I was going to give anyone advice, it would be, you need to seek 3 key individuals, and that is a coach, a mentor, and a sponsor. And these individuals are people who are going to assist you with navigating the most challenging times of your career. But I also promise you that they'll be there to high five you when you make your mark in your industry or your organization. No one's going to do it for you. The organization isn't going to do it for you. They're not going to look around the room and say, oh, geez, she's the one female out of 12 sitting at the senior leadership table. The only doors that are open for you are the ones that you choose to knock on. And that might sound cliche, but that's reality. You have to be willing to get a little uncomfortable and open the door. And, for me, it's been I've been really grateful for the experiences that I've had to support other women. I've thought about doing different support groups and things like that. I'm starting to speak on it a little bit at conferences as well, on just how to navigate that adversity and support each other.
Now, a couple of terms in health and safety we've heard a lot about. I'd like to ask you about it. The first one, it's not dying out, but we're not hearing quite as much about it as the second topic I'll mention in a moment. But the first one, safety culture. What are your thoughts on safety culture? When someone that was a pretty popular topic at health and safety conferences going back 3 and 4 or 5 years ago. Everybody was, safety culture. What's your thoughts on safety culture? If someone asks you, what is it?
Yeah, everybody likes to talk about safety culture, don't they?
Yeah.
So, I think is a positive environment where employees need to thrive. At the end of the day, I think that culture is culture. It doesn't matter if you put the word safety before it or not. As safety professionals, we may obviously have a lot of drive to uphold safety results and make sure that we have a good culture. But at the end of the day, our success in safety is built on the effort and commitment of the people within an organization, whether it's people leaders or our employees, et cetera. It's about the standards that's set within an organization and what is, are we willing to live with, and what do we walk by, and what do we accept as an organization when it comes to compassion and competitiveness to influence a healthy work environment? What does that look like at your organization? How do we retain talent and thrive and have those employees thrive based off a great working environment? At the end of the day, success as a whole, if we want to get there from a safety standpoint, then we have to look at where we're starting our business. So whether it's diversity and inclusion or whether it's employee experience in general, are our people happy? Do they want to show up each day? Like what are we doing for them, and what are they in return doing back for us, and what standards are we setting for them? If we have a good, healthy work environment and a healthy culture, then our safety outcomes are going to be successful. And that's what I would ultimately say safety culture is. It's really about the general culture of an organization.
Probably the second term and sort of the most popular term, I guess you could say, in today's health and safety lingo is psychological safety. Big topic at health and safety conferences, big topic in general. How would you describe psychological safety, and how do you create that in an organization?
So that's a big question for sure. I mean, I will not ever pretend to be an expert in that area. I think that's one of the things as a safety professional. You got to know your limitations and when to move a topic over to the professionals. And in this case, this one's definitely not me. However, what I will give you my insight from my perspective a little bit on it is I think you have to be compassionate, as I mentioned earlier. You have to be able to have empathy for folks enough, for your people enough to understand, where they're coming from. And I know it's a hard thing when it comes to personal safety and physical safety. It's really clear to see when someone has an injury. If you have a broken leg and you're wearing a cast, or, you sprained this or you sprained that, or what, you have a bruise or whatever the case may be, it's very transparent and you can see that, right? So, you can measure it a lot easier. It's hard to do that with psychological safety. Some people don't like to share what's going on with them, and that's a huge struggle and hurdle in itself. And then the other part is, how do we measure it? And does everyone really understand on the other end when someone says, hey, I have this going on, or I have mental health, et cetera, whatever it may be? I think at the end of the day, the best thing that you can do is seek out professionals. There's lots of people who speak to this, whether it's, psychologists, psychiatrists, or whether it's, I took a course at the North Dakota Safety Council Conference, or I sat in on a session from LEAP training in the U.S., and they had a phenomenal presentation on psychological safety. They also had a really great presentation on generational norms, which I think is a big part of psychological safety as well. How are we adapting and moving and growing and understanding the people that work for us at all of the different, generational phases within our organization? I think that's a big piece of it as well. So at the end of the day, I would say, how do we best support our people? No matter what business we're part of, we need to understand them.
Now, what do you see as the biggest challenges going ahead in health and safety, whether it's the generational ones that you just mentioned or other challenges you see coming sort of coming down the tube, as they say. What do you see as some of those, and what, as a health or safety professional, will you need to do to sort of keep up to date and keep growing in that area?
Yeah. So number one, by far, the biggest one is resources, finding people, especially post-COVID. Lots of organizations have really great, HR teams and folks who are really good at marketing and everything like that, but it still seems like we're struggling with finding people. And then above and beyond that, we talked earlier, as you said, psychological safety and the qualifications that we need as safety professionals. It's finding qualified candidates and seeing them in abundance is just not happening. So that's broadly one of the biggest challenges that we're faced with. If we want organizations to be successful, we need qualified candidates. And right now, and I foresee in the future, it's still being very hard to find them. And I know we talked about designations earlier, and we talked about education a little bit about the things that you can do. But the reality is, at the end of the day, you can check all those boxes and you can put a resume in front of someone and you can say, here's all the things that I have. But then when they show up at your door and you go to work, you find that they struggle with working with people, and there's all these other traits that maybe doesn't necessarily jive or fit within your organization. And what I'm talking about is finding people who are motivated to learn, who are modest and humble, who are willing to accept adversity and show up for work every day no matter what. Getting people that are dedicated and consistent, that potentially may want to not just meet but exceed your expectations. You need people in this day and age that are willing to be inclusive to newcomers and welcome diversity. You have to be capable of building better teams and strong relationships. You want to find individuals who not only are willing to be an ambassador for personal growth, but also for your operations growth. So no matter where you work, those are the type of people that you want to find, because that's the type of people that you can mold and that you can grow with and that you can also learn from as a leader. For me, best case scenario would be to find people who want my role and who want to do what I do, and to empower them to do that and to grow, and finding people who have the qualifications, designations, and experience, and then also have those traits. Or even if we're taking these people fresh out of school, you got to be willing and motivated to learn. And there just seems to be less of the abundance of those people around compared to years ago.
Now, you've mentioned that you're pretty active when it comes to health and safety and taking courses and so on. What about industry events, committees, those kind of things? Do you think they've been a benefit to you as well? And would you recommend them to new people to health and safety?
Yes, absolutely. I'm obviously quite an extroverted person, so I will be clear and say that out loud. So naturally, I like to meet and network other individuals. Some of the best mentors for me have been within our industry and that I've met at conferences. Any relationship that I've had, there's an individual who I met at the CRSP prep course years ago that I've stayed in touch with, and we've bounced ideas back and forth off each other. There's strength in numbers when it comes to HSE. We stick together. You want to support one another, and you just never know when you'll hit an obstacle someday and you'll be like, you know what? That individual has experienced this before. I remember them mentioning it, and call them up, staying in touch with them. So absolutely, everything from going to conferences, there's the ASSP in the U.S. that I go to each year. This year in July, they have the CSSE out in Edmonton. I have some of the folks who work for me going out to that. And then we have all the local stuff where it's really great to network and transpire with the people who are local to us, whether that, be in New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, Prince Edward Island, wherever the case may be. It's a really good opportunity. So I would challenge everyone to not only show up at these events and sit in on the sessions, but also go out and meet people. You find people in your industry or not, and say, hey, I'm so-and-so. It's nice to meet you, and make those connections, because there's really, really potential to meet great people, and you never know what opportunities may come from it. I mean, look at us sitting here. I'm on this podcast, and I met you guys at the Nova Scotia Safety Services Conference. So here we are. That's just a prime example of why we should get out and be engaged in our industry. And if you can find a local group where you can volunteer at, that's also a great way to build connections. So whether it's being a part of a safety services, or we have a group on Prince Edward Island that was created where it's just the safety professionals on the island. And for that group, it's a lot about engaging the smaller organizations, and for the bigger ones that have the resources, sharing them with them and including them and saying, hey, if you need to know something, here's my number and give me a call.
Now, you've already provided a lot of different bits of advice, things that you found have worked for you over the years. If you were to meet someone new to health and safety, just starting out, what advice would you give to them?
I would tell them kind of what I said earlier about the female piece, about finding a coach, a mentor, and a support. And what I mean by that is, a coach is someone who helps you on the day-to-day. A coach is someone who, tells you, hey, I wouldn't have written that email this way. I would have done this. And a mentor is someone who maybe is in a higher level position that you strive to be in someday, and who's kind of one step ahead of you. That is like, you may want to steer your career in this direction for these reasons. And then at the top, you have the sponsor, who that person believes in you and wants to see you meet your end goals, whether it's 5 years or 10 years from now. And I think you need all of these different people in your corner in order to truly be successful and help guide you, especially starting out in your career. So that goes back to, I said, making those connections. Another thing I would say is that high performers, and not that we're all striving out to be one, but if you are, they're not made up of the smartest person in the room or the smartest people in the room. Don't think that you have to be top percentile of your class to, reach the goals that you may want to reach or that sort of thing. They're the people who are willing to show up every day, no matter how much adversity hits them in the face, and just put the effort in. So my advice would be surround yourself with individuals who are out of your league. Show up with positive energy, no matter what your experience is. Empower others, so people around you and yourself, if you're new, to raise the standard. I'm a big advocate of challenging the status quo. If we want things to change, we can't show up and do the same thing over and over. So just challenge yourself on, am I making up an excuse, or am I really being my best self? When I was young, my dad always said, if you can show people what you're capable of instead of just telling them, and make sure that you're ready for the next role before it even becomes available or there's an opening, you'll have a better chance at successfully obtaining progressive roles if that's your goal. So set out with that in mind. I spent nights, weekends studying to be a gas process operator. I, advocate for myself and say, you know what? In order to meet my goals, my personal goals, here's some things I need to be exposed to this year, and asking the organization for them. Don't sit back and wait for something to happen. Don't be overly eager, but know your limits and go out there and say, okay, what can I learn today, and who can I learn it from?
Now, you mentioned the benefit of meeting people and learning from them. One of the great opportunities that I've been given is to do this podcast. And in talking to people during the podcast, all kinds of interesting stories have come out, and all kinds of interesting connections. As a peek to a future podcast that I'd like to do with you, you mentioned the last time we talked that your father had been involved in a rig that capsized. Do you want to give us a bit of I guess you could say a teaser to what we might look forward to coming up sometime as soon as we can arrange it, a podcast with you talking about what that event was and what happened?
Yeah, sure. So I do have a presentation that I give on the event that happened in 1988. My dad was on an oil rig with an organization that he ended up ultimately working for, I think it was around 37 or 38 years total. But he was on a rig that was on tow to the North Sea from Halifax. and it did capsize and sank. So I know we've all probably heard about, the Ocean Atlantic or some of the different rigs where there's been some significant injuries or even fatalities sustained. In this case, the positive news is that there was no fatalities in this event, which is great. But it also is a little bit of a different perspective to say, the outcome could have just as easily been that. And what I've learned through digging through this event is how data-driven decisions and having the right people in the right positions to support that business is ultimately why my dad is alive today. So absolutely, I would love to share that story, and we can talk more about that if you guys have the interest to in the future, because it's one I think that especially leaders out there can learn from.
Sure, we'd certainly like to hear that story. Well, look, Kaela, we could talk all day, but I've sort of run out of time here, as they say. Thank you very much for being on our podcast today. We appreciate all your ideas and suggestions you have for women in health and safety. For our listeners, again, if you have any ideas for either speakers or topics you'd like to hear, we'd love to hear from you. podcast@ssnb.ca. And in conclusion, I guess I could say thank you very much, Kaela, and we'll see you next week.
Thanks, Pearlie.